Election news leader, and we're getting reaction tonight after former President Trump selected JD Vance as his running mate. KLTV7's Michael Richardson spoke with East Texas Republican leaders to get their thoughts on the VP pick.
Ohio Senator JD Vance's selection as Trump's running mate has been mostly applauded by the GOP. That includes party leaders in East Texas.
He's a good pick. He's going to bring a lot of energy.
JD is a great pick.
Vance used to be critical of Trump.
I'm definitely not going to vote for Trump because I think that he's projecting very complex problems onto simple villains.
Gregg County GOP Chair William McWhorter weighed in on Vance's previous dislike of the former president.
I think it's an asset. You have someone that had very staunch opinions and views on President Trump, 8, 9 years ago, that has now truly seen the importance of the message.
Trump's VP choice comes at a different stage of his political career than when he selected Mike Pence in 2016.
I think Pence was a little bit at arm's length when they first started. I think he knows Vance better than he knew Pence. But to that point I think that he's going to utilize Vance in some stronger ways.
As last weekend's assassination attempt brings more focus to who can assume the presidency, Smith County Chair David Stein feels confident in Trump's decision.
I am sure President Trump would not have selected him if he didn't feel confident if he could step into that role if necessary.
Michael Richardson, KLTV 7 News.
Tonight, former presidential candidate Nikki Haley is expected to speak at the GOP convention. Former President Trump is set to take the stage there on Thursday.